the Haunt Vault, where we open the doors to the dark and twisted corners of human imagination. Tonight's tale dives deep into obsession, control, and the chilling consequences of losing yourself to the things you love most. Imagine beating death itself, only to be trapped in a nightmare far worse than anything you could have fought in the real world. For John, survival was just the beginning. Now, in a virtual world he once escaped to, he finds himself fighting a different kind of horror, one he never saw coming. Get ready to be haunted by tonight's story. Game over. John had always been a fighter. Life had thrown its worst at him, and he had stood his ground every time. 3 times cancer had tried to claim him, and 3 times he had fought it off, leaving scars on his body that told a tale of resilience and unwavering determination. Each battle had only strengthened his resolve to live a life that mattered, a life full of joy, love, and the simple pleasures he had fought so hard to preserve. After his final victory over the disease, John and his girlfriend, Lisa, decided it was time to settle down and truly savor the life they had fought to protect. They were inseparable, sharing their days exploring the world, planning new adventures, and relishing the small joys that made each moment precious. Whether it was a weekend trip to the countryside or a quiet evening cooking together, every experience felt like a celebration of their shared triumph over adversity. As winter settled in, however, the once vibrant outdoors turned cold and gray. The chill in the air seemed to seep into their lives, and John found himself spending more time indoors. The adventures that had once fueled his spirit now seemed distant memories, replaced by the monotony of winter days. It was during this time that John rediscovered his old love for video games. What started as a harmless pastime to fill the long, cold evenings soon grew into something more. At first, it was just a few hours here and there, a way to pass the time. But the virtual worlds offered an escape, a place where he could lose himself in quests and challenges far removed from the realities of life. It wasn't long before Lisa noticed the change. John, once so engaged in their shared life, was now retreating deeper into his digital escapades. Hours turned into days as he sat hunched over his computer, his focus entirely absorbed by the glowing screen. Lisa watched with growing concern as John's passion for gaming morphed into an obsession. Their plans, once the highlight of their days, began to crumble. Projects they had started together were abandoned, trips they had eagerly anticipated were canceled, and Lisa felt a growing distance between them. She tried to reach out to pull him back to the life they had built together, but John was slipping further away, lost in a world of pixels and codes.
John,
Lisa would say, gently placing a hand on his shoulder in an attempt to draw him away from the screen.
we need to talk. We haven't spent any real time together in weeks.
Just one more level.
He'd reply, his eyes never leaving the game, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. Lisa's concern slowly turned to frustration, then to anger. The man who had fought so fiercely to stay alive was now losing himself to a virtual world, and she felt powerless to stop it. The John she had known, the fighter, the adventurer, the man who cherished every moment, was fading, replaced by someone she hardly recognized. One evening, after another day of trying in vain to get John's attention, Lisa suggested they watch a movie together. It was a small gesture, a way to reconnect, but even this seemed like a struggle. John reluctantly agreed, though it was clear his mind was still consumed by the game he had left paused. They sat on the couch, the movie playing in the background as Lisa poured them both a glass of wine. John took a sip, noticing a subtle difference in the taste. It wasn't unpleasant, just different, but he was too tired, too numb from hours of gaming to give it much thought. The next morning, John awoke with a start. Something was wrong. The bed was empty, and Lisa was nowhere to be found. Groggily, he rubbed his eyes, only to realize that this wasn't their bed at all. The room was unfamiliar, the air thick with the scent of soil and machinery. He bolted upright, panic rising in his chest as he looked out the window. He wasn't at home. He was on a farm. Not just any farm, though. It was the farm from his favorite video game, the one he had been obsessively playing for weeks. He knew every inch of it, the fields, the barn, the farmhouse. But this was no game. The dirt under his fingernails was real. The sun blazing overhead was real, and the sweat dripping down his face was very real. Before he could process what was happening, an invisible force took hold of him. His body moved against his will, his limbs acting as if they were being controlled by some unseen hand. He found himself walking out into the fields, grabbing tools and working the land. The actions were familiar. He had performed them countless times in the game, but now they were terrifyingly real. Every step, every motion felt as though he was a puppet on strings, his body no longer his own. As the days dragged on, John's sense of time began to blur. Some days seemed to stretch on forever, the work endless and grueling, while others passed in a haze of exhaustion. His muscles ached, his hands blistered from the relentless labor, but he couldn't stop. The machinery he knew so well, the tractors, the plows, the harvesters, stood idle, just out of reach. He tried to use them to ease his burden, but the invisible force kept pulling him back to the fields, forcing him to work by hand. The sun beat down on him as he toiled under the unyielding sky, the days blending into one another in a nightmarish cycle. John's mind began to unravel. He was trapped in a nightmare, a game he couldn't quit. His thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the impossible situation he was in. But there was something gnawing at the back of his mind, a connection he hadn't yet made. It wasn't until he was out in the fields one afternoon, the sun high above him, that the memory surfaced, the scent of the wine. It was the same scent he had noticed before waking up here. That subtle, almost imperceptible difference. And suddenly, it all made sense. Lisa. She was the one controlling him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She had found a way to make him a part of the game, to turn his obsession into a living nightmare. The reason he had to work everything by hand, despite the machinery, was because she was the one playing. He was nothing more than a character in her game now, forced to endure the endless grind she had set for him. John fell to his knees in the dirt, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He had fought cancer 3 times and won, but this was a battle he couldn't fight. He was trapped, at the mercy of the woman he loved, forced to play out the rest of his days in a twisted version of the life he had once cherished. And somewhere, far away in the real world, Lisa sat in front of her computer screen, controlling his every move, the glass of that strange wine by her side. She watched with a calm, almost detached expression as John toiled away in the fields, his every action a reflection of her commands. But something strange began to happen. As days passed in the game world, John's struggle began to fade. The panic that had once gripped him was slowly replaced by a numb acceptance. The work, though grueling, became routine, and the terror that had consumed him gave way to a kind of mechanical obedience. His mind, once sharp and alert, dulled with each passing day, until all that remained was the drive to complete the tasks set before him. Meanwhile, Lisa's life in the real world underwent a transformation of its own. Her initial concern for John had faded, replaced by a growing fascination with the game. She found herself spending more and more time in front of the screen, controlling John's actions, guiding his every move. The thrill of power, of being able to dictate someone else's life, even if only in a game, was intoxicating. Their work projects that had once consumed her time were now forgotten, abandoned in favor of her new obsession. The game had taken over her life, just as it had taken over John's. But for Lisa, there was no turning back. The virtual world had become her reality, and the thrill of control was too powerful to resist. As she clicked away at her keyboard, her mind no longer dwelled on the world outside. Her friends, her ambitions, even her love for John, everything was secondary to the game. And so, Lisa, once driven by creativity and passion, was now a prisoner of her own making, trapped in a digital landscape where she held all the power but none of the freedom. The game was over. But for John and Lisa, the nightmare had only just begun. If you enjoyed tonight's story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the Haunt Vault for more chilling tales. What would you do if your greatest escape turned into your worst nightmare? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and story ideas. And remember, the things we think we control may just be controlling us. Until next time, keep your lights on and your fears close. See you in the next story.